It is so good to be here. I've been really excited, Charmaine, since you reached out. One of the things I most enjoy is talking with other people who are also living with chronic illnesses. And I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more. My own background is in the 90s, I was a family practice doctor and taught residents and medical students. And I had a sense that despite all the training I had, that I really didn't quite have the tools to work with symptoms other than providing Band-Aids. It's more clear now in retrospect, but at the time, I felt as though there was something deeper driving symptoms than what I knew. And my own sense was that there was an intelligence to symptoms. And I was really curious about that. And I ended up leaving medicine and taking a year off to kind of figure out, am I going to go back to medicine in some different format, or do I need to do something different? And I ended up retraining as a psychotherapist and specializing. I didn't know this existed, but I ended up finding a program in somatic psychotherapy, which is really all about learning to listen to the body, learning to be curious about what's happening in the body, whether it's images, whether it's symptoms, and learning how to work with that. And that's where I first got introduced to the concept of trauma. My sense as a physician, and I think this is still very common to how we're trained as physicians, was that trauma was really in the realm of psychiatry and mental health. It was really folks, for example, veterans in the military with PTSD, and that it had nothing to do with me and medical care or medicine or the symptoms people had that I was working with. But in this program, I was writing a paper one day looking for an example, and the focus was mental health. But looking for this example, I wondered, what if these things that are leading to mental health conditions could be the same things leading to changes in our physiology or in our biology to be affecting risk for chronic illness? And that got me started on the past 25 years of looking at the research with this question in mind. And so I've been looking at the medical research with this question: is there any evidence that trauma could be a risk factor for chronic illness? And I've been sharing that on my blog for the past 14 years, sharing the science, because it's really hard to find, actually. And I would guess that most of you have probably not had physicians who are familiar with this, among other health professionals. And then the other component that informs what I'm doing is that I have my own chronic illness. I've had chronic fatigue for 25 years myself, and it's been quite a fascinating journey. It's not always fascinating, but we learn so much from it, as I think many of you have experienced as well. It's not something we would have chosen. But when my chronic fatigue first started, I was in medicine, and my sense was that it must be just stress related. That's still a common perception when we have symptoms, that stress is a really big component and perhaps a cause. And at that point, I used to have what I called fatigue attacks. So I'd be fine, and then out of the blue, it would seem I would have an attack that might last for a few days. And I'd be so tired that it was effortful to roll over in bed at night. And then it would go away and I'd be fine. And so part of leaving medicine at the time, I wasn't leaving because of my health, but I would not have been able to continue if I had stayed because of my health. And so I left, and discovered this whole new world. So what I'm going to talk about today is onset triggers, not everyone has a sense of something that may have triggered the onset of your chronic illness. Sometimes it seems like it comes out of the blue, but we're going to talk about that. And then there are clues from autoimmune diseases where they can track antibodies. I'm going to share some research from type 1 diabetes, which seems to have the most research in the role of trauma or serious life events. And then just to kind of help distinguish a little bit, I want to talk about the difference between stress and trauma. And then I'm really looking forward to questions and seeing where we go with that. Often it feels like our chronic illnesses start out of the blue, just as it had with me. But for a lot of folks, I would imagine that there may have been an onset trigger or a period of time where there was a lot going on in the few months, maybe in the year or two before the onset of the chronic illness. And what is really kind of intriguing to me is that there are so many different onset triggers. If we were to poll this group, we would probably come up with a lot more examples than are even the ones that are here. Infections seem to be the most common. Different infections, same disease. 50% or so of people with chronic fatigue, which is what I have, seem to have the onset after an infection. It's also very common, I think, in autoimmune diseases. And it's very interesting. Why would so many different kinds of infections cause the same disease? It's not a linear thing, of course, as you guys know. And then the other 50% or so seem to be all kinds of other stressful events. And it could be a vaccine, which doesn't necessarily seem like a stressful event. And at the end, we'll kind of come back to this and look at what might be some common or a common underlying factor that unites these onset triggers. So clues from antibodies. The literature shows that antibodies can show up quite a long time before some of these autoimmune diseases. So type 1 diabetes, 13 years or longer. Lupus, 9 years. Rheumatoid factor can show up 10 years or more. And we don't tend to think of Parkinson's as being autoimmune, but there's at least one case study where there was an autoimmune antibody that showed up over 10 years before the symptoms actually began. And so I started learning about this, and I found this really quite intriguing, as did this researcher, Gisela Dahlquist in Sweden. Type 1 diabetes, again, as many of you know, about half of it begins in childhood. Half of the people who develop type 1 develop it in childhood. And so she was using this information about the presence of antibodies showing up so much earlier and wondering if it starts in childhood, could that mean that we've got pre and perinatal risk factors for type 1 diabetes? And so she did a study and found out that yes, there were actually quite a number of risk factors. It could be illness in the mother or the baby. It could be how the birth proceeded. So babies born by cesareans in this study actually had a higher risk. And she and her group and others have done studies in looking at the pre and perinatal risk factors. And other people have done this in other chronic illnesses and other autoimmune diseases and found risk as well. But they don't always all show the same thing. So for example, not everyone born by cesarean has an increased risk of a chronic illness, and not everyone with an autoimmune disease, of course, was born by cesarean. And so she kind of wondered what might be going on, kind of similar to this question about onset triggers. Is there something in common with these risk factors? And she did a number of other studies. One of them was with mice and mice that were at risk for type 1 diabetes. And what she ended up concluding was there might be two risk factors in common in particular. So looking at those pre and perinatal events, they were all stressful. And a lot of them, if not most of them, caused separation between mother and baby, between father and baby, partner, family system, and baby. And there's another body of research that actually supports this very specifically, and that it's not just physical separation, it can actually be emotional separation, so that these stressful events or losing a parent, if the mother loses a parent during this time period, the grief, if there's scary things going on, these can really interfere with that innate bonding capacity that we have. And that all of itself can interfere with the regulation that happens between mother, father, and baby. If something's going on for the parents or for the baby, there can be really some challenges with regulation. So that I thought was fascinating. And ultimately, yes, there's all kinds of studies finding that events in babyhood, as I like to think about it, are risk factors, have been found to be risk factors for autoimmune disease and other chronic illnesses. Another research study in type 1 diabetes is known as the ABIS study. And ABIS was so well studied, the results were so significant that when it was published in 2015, it was in a lot of the regular daily news outlets. This is where it was in Time magazine, for example. So a study looking at trauma came out and was everywhere. And I really don't hear people talk about it now, 10 years later. I don't think it educated a lot of physicians or even a lot of us in the general population, but it was kind of astounding to me that it was in so many outlets. And so what they did in the ABIS study, also in Sweden, was they looked at and took babies. They asked parents and families for permission for all these babies born in this one community. They ended up with 10,000 babies in the study to start with. And these were not babies who were at genetic risk for type 1 diabetes. These were babies from the general population. They followed them from birth, and they did studies. They did these 3 studies looking at antibodies and a few other time periods with questionnaires. And what they found at 1 year of age was that there were more antibodies in the babies who had experienced more stressful events. And in this study, they were really casting a wide net. They talked about these as serious life events, or SLEs. Parental stress was one of them. All these others were included, even psychological stress in the family system. So really broad, really general, not specific. It's kind of shocking in a way to think that this level of stress could have an impact on antibodies. They also noted this was independent of family history, suggesting that this was not related to genetic risk in the population. And at 2.5 years, same thing. They looked very specifically at 2 events: if their mother had gotten divorced or experienced domestic violence. And here again, the antibodies were much higher in the kids, the toddlers who had experienced this. And again, it was independent of family history. Then what they looked at was antibodies progressing all the way to type 1 diabetes. And when they looked at kids who developed type 1 by the age of 14, those children were the ones, they'd experienced 3 times more serious life events than the kids who might have antibodies but had not progressed, for example. And again, here it was a really wide net. So it could be illness in the child, but it could be illness in the family system. And again, just really this concept of how things that we might consider as a normal part of life, and they are, but they actually can have an impact. We don't just move on. They can have an impact on what's happening in our systems. So risk factors in babyhood and childhood are seen in autoimmune diseases and other chronic illnesses. And there's other studies here too that back up the role of childhood trauma. Many of you may have heard of the adverse childhood experiences studies, the ACE studies. Those are the most well-known. They have been, the first one was published in 1998, And there have been hundreds of studies replicated around the world with different groups, different populations. There's also a study looking specifically at autoimmune diseases and finding that if you had any of the 10 particular ACEs, as they refer to them, there was a higher risk for autoimmune diseases. And all you had to do was have 2 ACEs. I don't have time to go into that today, but ACEs are a big body of research that supports the role of trauma in risk for autoimmune diseases. So this out of the blue concept, for many of us, when there is an onset trigger, it can feel and seem as though the onset trigger is actually the cause of our chronic illness. And it can seem as though we need to address that. So treating the infection, addressing whatever it is that the accident, recovering from that. And I would suspect that, again, here, many of you may have done that. It's a very natural response and impulse. And I think some people may get better with that, but a lot of us, and I would think especially those of you who are here, it wasn't enough. So when I took the year off from medicine, thinking with a huge decrease in stress, huge change in my hours and my schedule, that my fatigue would change. And instead of decreasing, it actually worsened. So that was kind of intriguing. When we use what we're learning from antibody patterns, we can see that there are antibodies in babyhood, there are antibodies in childhood, and that ultimately what they've seen, for example, in the ABIS study, but also in other studies of type 1, is that the more antibodies someone has and the more different kinds of antibodies they have, the greater the risk over time of actually progressing to type 1 diabetes. And I would imagine, and I don't know the other research, but that this is similar for other autoimmune diseases as well. What this brings up is this concept about the role of environment. And when I was a physician and there too in my training, I really came away with the sense that chronic illnesses are genetic, that they're primarily genetic, that the underlying risk is primarily genetic. And the feeling I had until I started learning about this, again, I think primarily from my medical training, but also in our medical perspective in this culture, our westernized culture, was that if it's genetic, there really isn't much you can do about it. And I think from looking at your website and listening to some of your videos, part of the reason your group is here is that a lot of times we're not told anything by the physician. You're given the diagnosis and come back and see me in 3 months or 6 months. And what you guys have been discovering as you're educating yourselves, and as so many of us are learning one individual at a time, is that there are a lot of things we can do. Lifestyle factors being a big one. But again, what comes back as emphasis is that environmental factors are actually much, much more important than I ever thought, and that I think our medical training still doesn't quite recognize this. And part of this is that risk for chronic illness appears to be less than 50% genetic. And in fact, it may be even less than that, 10 to 30% risk from genes. It may be that there's an underlying genetic risk and that it requires environmental exposures, life events, exposures of all these different kinds to activate the genes and increase risk. And not everyone agrees with that. Some people say it's really not about the genes as much as it is about these life experiences. And trauma and stress actually, and if I go specifically, trauma actually can increase all these other things. It can increase our sensitivity to toxins, our sensitivity to chemicals, how we absorb in our gut, how our immune systems respond to infections. So my whole orientation, while there's a lot of complexity into the process that leads to chronic illness, is that the role of trauma is really underestimated. Charles Posner is a physician who was well known, who did a ton of research in multiple sclerosis. And he thought about this process that happens over decades as being like the development of an undersea volcano, where the volcano is when the symptoms finally become visible, but there's all this stuff that's been going on for years beforehand. One of the things he looked at is that there may be a period in childhood where risk is actually initiated. And if you get through that okay, then you're not going to get the chronic illness. These clouds actually represent, I think of as trauma or adverse events, and that may be part of what is required to turn those genes on or activate them. We see the same pattern in PTSD. People who develop PTSD, I always thought it was simply straightforward from, let's say, it's the combat veteran exposure, what they've experienced. But what the research is showing, and one of the prime researchers in the field of PTSD is Rachel Yehuda, what they've been finding is that the soldiers, for example, the veterans who do develop PTSD, have more commonly, more likely experienced adversity before, at other times in their childhoods, at other times in their lives. And the ones who have more severe PTSD, or where the PTSD developed at a younger age, had more severe trauma when they were younger. So the hope from all this, so that it's in a way, it's not all doom and gloom, in the sense that we already have our chronic illnesses, so we're already there. What is it that we can do about it? And it seems to me that there's a lot of hope from what we're learning about antibodies. The ABIS study and others have found that antibodies are common in the general population. So for example, type 1 diabetes antibodies are quite common in healthy people who don't ever go on to develop type 1. But also those antibodies can resolve. So in the kids, in the ABIS study looking at the kids who developed antibodies, some of them had antibodies that resolved, went away completely, and who did not go on to develop type 1. And so what's that about? What can be done? Can we do things for prevention? And what might be done if we already have a chronic illness or autoimmune disease? So before we go further with that, that'll be more, I think, the topic for next week. But I want to talk a bit about the stress versus trauma. The concept of stress, when I was looking this up, working on my master's thesis when I went back to school for psychotherapy, I really wanted this definition, and this fit the best. It's the concept of stress is actually a very neutral thing. A stressor is anything that asks you or your system to adapt. So it may be that you're cold. That's a stressor. Your body has the opportunity to tell you that information, and then you have the option to turn up the temperature or put on a sweater. And when you do that, the stressor is gone. You're no longer cold. And so that symptom goes away. And we see that same with other kinds of stressors. If you're in overwork and you're able to set boundaries and stop doing the overwork, the stress can go away and you can return to baseline. Same thing if we're actually able to run away from the bear, for example. So the concept of stress is that if it's a stressor and you address it, the symptoms resolve. Trauma is different. The concept of trauma is that it's a negative life event that happens. So it's not a neutral event, it's negative. And it happens when we ourselves are in a relative state of helplessness. And that's actually key. So the state of helplessness can happen because we've been in a car accident and we didn't have time to react. We couldn't get out of the way. We couldn't turn the car out of the way. So that would be a state of relative helplessness where we couldn't fight our way out, we couldn't flee our way out, and we couldn't talk our way out. That's a whole other system of defense. So these other things, even something like a frightening medical procedure or surgery, can have that same impact if you are in a state of relative helplessness when that happens. maybe a bunch of things go on. Maybe you feel really alone. Maybe the healthcare professionals aren't talking to you or treating you well. So, and trauma is any experience of helplessness, and it doesn't matter what the event is. Whatever the event is, so if it's a car accident or it's surgery, it can elicit, if you're in that state of helplessness, the same changes in your physiology that if you were experiencing something that we know and generally accept and consider to be traumatic, such as abuse, for example. So the nature of trauma isn't actually the event. It isn't even that it's a life-threatening event. It's the degree of helplessness that we experienced when we went through it. So it's not the event, it's actually dependent on us as individuals and what state we were in. Did we have support? Did we not? And this concept of helplessness is also known as freeze. So we talk about fight, flight, but very, very rarely do you hear about freeze. And freeze is a nervous system, a message to the nervous system that we didn't actually survive, that we didn't actually escape, that we didn't complete the action to get out of the situation. And so unless we can work through that trauma, the nervous system gets caught in a state that where it perceives that we're still in the event and that we're still in that survival mode. So it's not the event. And that kind of comes back to what Gisela Dahlquist with the diabetes research was saying when she was looking at the pre and perinatal factors and saying, maybe it's because they're stressful or they involve separation. And that's what we're learning about trauma is it's not the event, it's how we experienced it. So the freeze is a message in the brain about it not being over. And so that leads us to this prolonged sense where our bodies, it's as if they get caught in a state of survival. Bob Scare, who I've been quoting throughout this, was a retired neurologist when I met him, and he learned about trauma pretty late in his career. And this is a term he coined about symptoms of trauma, that it's not a tissue issue, it's actually a nervous system issue. And from what I've been learning and working with my own health and with clients, and when I've been working from the trauma perspective, I think chronic illness is similar. It starts as a nervous system issue before it becomes a tissue issue. So if we go back to look at onset triggers and clues about what's going on during that period of onset, what could be common among all of these? And what could be common is that they all are acting to strengthen in this last event, this last straw event, that they're actually strengthening a pattern, a survival pattern that's been developing or evolving over years or decades. And the work of Robert Navio out of UC San Diego, he refers to this as a cell danger response, but it's the same perspective. So an infection is seen as from the body as a threat, and the body wants to mobilize towards that infection. If we've had a long-standing, gradually out of sight, underneath the ocean waves, developing process of survival, it could be that the infection is the last straw that triggers this well-grooved perception of threat, and that our immune system either overreacts or underreacts or does something where it's not able to be successful in fighting off this infection. Same thing with any of these other events, that all of them are stressors that trigger the perception of threat. So in the second webinar next week, I want to talk a bit more about what the implications might be for autoimmune diseases, for how we might work with symptoms from this perspective. And I'll just come to a conclusion here with a few more slides. What we're talking about today is that life events do have an impact on risk for chronic illness, and there are many different bodies of research that support this, and that the past does have an impact on how we are now, but also that, and I suspect many of you have been told it's in your heads before it was ever figured out what you had. The research in trauma, but also in chronic illnesses, is really clear. It's not in your head. It's not a figment of our imaginations. It's actually something that gets shifted in our biology, in our genes, the genes that get turned on or off, in our biology, our immune systems, our nervous systems. And here too, I find the research helpful because it also states how it's not our fault. There's a very common view that we cause our chronic illnesses based on our lifestyles and what we're doing. If we're not exercising enough, or we're eating wrong, or we have too much stress. But those, as we were talking about, that's the last straw. And it wouldn't trigger a chronic illness, I don't think, unless we had this underlying pattern that's been brewing for a long time. So Charmaine, I've given Charmaine a handout to send to you guys. It's a PDF with links to a number of posts on my blog that will serve as references for things I've talked about today. And I also have surveys on my blog because, especially thinking of a lot of autoimmune diseases that are fairly rare, I don't think any of them have ever been studied for the role of trauma. So we don't really know for sure. And there's a lot of nuance that isn't in the research. And so I invite you to take surveys on my blog that also give you a sense of what might look like the kind of events that are associated with risk. And I have a few of them up now, and I'll be creating more over time. There's also, I have over 40 free ebooks. So they're kind of detailed. A lot of them are summary. They're actually from blog posts. You can download them as a PDF. Some of them you can download as a Kindle. And I also have some fact sheets. So there's a ton of information out there. And the reason I created my blog is to empower all of us so we have this information. So we'll see. I'm looking forward to the questions, and that'll shape next week. But what I'm thinking of presenting is at least one case example to highlight what I've been talking about here today, and also looking at how the concept of trauma might be a way we can work with triggers and flares. And then, of course, the question, I don't know that we don't really know, but I think it brings up many possibilities for prevention, and the possibility of, can we stabilize our symptoms? Can we reverse them? I don't think we know for sure, but there are people who are kind of figuring this out as we go.